First of all, I'd like to thank you all and thank the Mama for inviting me here today to give this talk. This talk is based, it comes out of research, ongoing research that I've been doing around the representation by artists of the Palestinian landscape. And so it comes out of a long research of looking at this question of how the landscape of Palestine has been represented. This comes out of my own interest from the time when I was at university. I'd never visited Palestine, and I was very interested in how artists, Palestinian artists, were representing Palestine in the landscape in particular, because I was in a setting in which there was a lot of colonial and a lot of preconceptions about Palestine, both in the media, but then in a lot of historic texts, and then also you can find it in the hymns, in the churches, and so forth. So there was a vision of the landscape very much that was in British culture, and I was very interested in how Palestinians themselves were representing the landscape. So the artworks that you will see today, I mean, mainly come from two artists, although there are a lot of themes that you will find covered in other artists' works, and they're the works of Slimane Mansour and Nabil Anani. And what I'm really interested in is what is the vision that they create in these works, and what is omitted and what is left out, and what kind of landscape they're creating. So probably an artwork that you're all probably very familiar with is The Camel of Hardships by Slimane Mansour from 1974, and there are several versions of this work. And I'm really interested in how he represents Jerusalem. Because if we see the way he depicts the city, it's a very utopian city. The light in it is very white. The buildings are all gleaming. There are no traces of modernity. There are no traces of for example, the satellites that are on the roofs, the water tanks, the washing. Any of the details of everyday life are all omitted from this. It's a very kind of glorified city, and all these traces of everyday life are not there. In contrast, if we see the landscape that the carrier is in, is completely a nondescript landscape. It has no details of habitation, there's nobody there, it's a real kind of desert scape, and it sits in very strong contrast to this city. So I think here he's creating this whole idea of this ideal city, this utopic city, this perfect Jerusalem, which is also being held with reverence above his head. And we're very used to this iconic image. We find it on posters, on calendars and so forth, but we rarely kind of look at the detail of what type of landscape he is creating in this particular image. Similarly, also here, we see this this image of Jerusalem. Again, the details that I was speaking about of the city are all omitted. Holy sites are precedent in it, but the details of everyday life and its complexities are all erased. Again, a desert landscape is in the background. And what here is featured, which we will see in upcoming slides, is this figure of the motherland. The motherland really came into prominence in a lot of the artworks that were from the late 1970s through the 80s. The representation of Palestine as a female figure, one comes from the language as Palestine being feminine, but then also it's echoed in a lot of literature. It was also revealed in poetry, in writing, in theatre, in dance. The lost landscape is always articulated as this mother. It's described as a separation between oneself and another figure. This is not particularly unusual because nations either depict themselves as fatherlands or motherlands. It's not particular to Palestine that we're using this kind of model of representations. Germany, for example, was a fatherland, so it's done all over the world. But we very much in Palestinian discourses, if we're thinking of dance, if we're thinking of the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish or Fadwa Tuqar, they speak of this separation or this longing for the homeland through this relationship to a mother figure. So we find it recurring in a lot of artworks. Again, just to take you through this kind of images of Jerusalem, they appear to be very nostalgic. There's an absence of the hustle and bustle of the city, and it's different movement through it. It's a very romanticized kind of imagery of the city, and these are all different works by Sherwell. Again, here we can see the female. You'll see a continual recurring of female figures in these utopian landscapes, and they often have they're carrying children. They're in nurturing positions. Their gazes are either looking upwards or outwards of the picture frame. They very rarely have a visual contact with us in terms of their gaze reaching outside of the frame. So there's this, and often there's an absence of male figures as well. So this always puts us in this kind of also nurturing position towards them, that we also want to take care of these women and so on. These are all very kind of deliberate representations to kind of foster our affiliation with these locations. Again here, Jerusalem, a whole mosaic of different patterns and traditions. Again, all these works are so very far removed from the actual reality of the city. A lot of these works were made in the 1980s. This is a severe period under occupation. This is where the Palestinian flag couldn't be held, when the word Palestinian identity couldn't be articulated, when artworks were confiscated, and so forth. But the artists aren't representing any of this, you know. And during all that time, what that's happening, they're not representing historically what was happening on the ground in the city. So then you start asking yourself, well, you know, why are they doing, you know, why are these particular types of representations being created? What is the decision making that's going on in order to leave all of that out? And we can look at possibly various different types of explanations. I think one, we could possibly explain it that they were feeling a sense of alienation, and so they prefer to go back to some kind of romantic past that they're thinking about, or some ideal that they are trying to create. Another, when you speak to the artists and you interview them, they're talking about the idea that they very much wanted to stay steadfast in their identity, and that they wanted to create a visual vocabulary of what Palestinian identity was at that time. So the Palestinian dress, the idea of the motherland, this utopic image of untouched Jerusalem, I would say. So in a sense, we could also read it as a response to that type of alienation that they were experiencing under occupation, and a sense that they wanted to create a vocabulary of cultural identity that then becomes incredibly, it becomes used over and over again. We start seeing these symbols repeated throughout artworks all the way through the 80s and 90s to a point that it becomes almost exhausted. The woman in the Palestinian tomb, the image of Jerusalem just as particular sites and not anything else to do with its complexity of the geography of the city, and so forth. So we have this utopian vision not just only in the image of Jerusalem, but we also have it in the wider sense in the landscape at large. And if we look at the type of landscapes that these artists were creating in the 80s, again we can notice that they appear timeless. It's very hard to put them in a particular time frame, to be able to take any details from the work to situate it in a historical moment. Again, there's an absence of modernity, of architectural detail. I mean, there's no cars, there's no satellites, there's no. It's all absent. It's though time has stopped, and when has it stopped is also the question. A very recurring symbol in this is as you see here, and in this next work, a women working in agriculture. And again, the woman is always in traditional Palestinian dress. She's gazing outside of the frame in this kind of melancholic, misty, kind of looking off into the distance. The landscapes are very full of golden light. All the trees and the harvests, abundancy. You don't get any sense of there being a poor harvest or so forth. So there's an incredible harmony and a utopic vision of what village life is like, which again is quite far removed from an actuality of village life, because from the Ottoman period up until the present day, life in villages is constantly transforming. Particularly during the 80s when this work was made, a lot of the villagers were moving into working in Israel as manual laborers. The whole structure of village life was changing. None of this. It's completely absent. The roads that were being opened up, the beginning of settlements, it's all vacated from these works. And they're very idealistic, they're very harmonious. This is another work that's called The Village Awakens. And again there we see this really huge, large, monumental Palestinian woman figure. The village is marching out from her. You've got different types of work. You've got the stone cutters, you've got them picking oranges, working the land, and again everything is incredibly harmonious. So we could also think that this kind of representation that becomes the whole repertoire, particularly in the work of Slimane Mansour, but then other artists who are part of the League of Palestinian Artists, creates an image of a future Palestine that is cast in an image of the past. But it's a very utopic past based on an ideal of what village life is like, and not based on the historical changes and transformations that took place in villages. So this idea of the return to the village and village life being the utopia that, or being the Palestine that we want to live in, was very prominent in the 80s. And artists also have said that they went back to drawing and painting in the village, that they felt that the village was a site of authenticity, that it was untouched, that it wasn't changed. And so there was there's an incredible amount of nostalgia around village life that is, again, that the complexity of transformation is not represented. You can see more of these works. You see this continual monumental mother figure keeps recurring in the works. And what is quite specific about her is that what is quite specific about her is that it also becomes quite hard to identify with her, because she's we can't really feel that she's our sister or somebody that we know. She becomes kind of a very generic female figure. She's incredibly also monumental. If you look in all these works, the scale of this woman is almost like a statue. So you begin to feel that like she's like a statue, and she's almost created from stone, rather than to identify with her as a flesh and blood person. You see also the kind of patterning that's always taking place in the landscape too. The figuration of the agriculture is always in this very rich pattern structure, which again is always talking about the abundance of the land rather than any hardships that exist on the land. Here we have this again. So you can see this repetition of this timelessness continuing in these landscapes. Again, we see this also in the work of Ismail Shamhout. He was also another artist that articulated these ideas around utopic landscapes. Here we have, again, a huge motherland figure, in this term as the bride, and her dress takes the shape of the map of Palestine. And here we see, this utopia where children are playing in the fields of poppies. There's a wedding taking place. Again, these are recurring themes that Ismail Shamhout also used. His works are also incredibly timeless in the way in which he's presenting the landscape. And he tends to present them as an amalgam as well, so we can't particularly place them in any particular time period. Another work by Slimane Mansour that almost leads me to a point to begin to, I kind of call a lot of these works dreamscapes, because they really do feel like dreams being, not related to the actual location. So here we see, for example, again, the Palestinian woman, the jar, the embroidery. The embroidery looks like kites that are floating. The village, again, there's an absence of the community or the population. There's only a few individual figures. It's divorced from the rest of the landscape as well. It seems to be just floating in this space. Coming back to the harmonious landscape that I was speaking about, so this is, for example, one of these examples of these works. This is also by Slimane Mansour. It's called The Olive Pickers. It's from 1983. And again, you have this, harmonious community. Everybody's working together. We're all picking the olives. Again, this timelessness is there in the work. We can't particularly specify where the location is. And this was also very typical in many of their works. They wouldn't actually title a particular location. It would all be the village, life in the village awakens, and so forth. So Palestine becomes this kind of generic village. It becomes a key way of representing our relationship to the land and our identity is through the village and through Islam. So, and that's why, along with that, there was all the emphasis on the Palestinian Torah, on all the items that are in the domestic setting, like in Jabra, the baskets, everything that's caught around a very specific domestic setting becomes all the different markers of identity. And you'll see people having these in their home or decorating them in restaurants now. And it's those objects that were taken from the context of the village become our markers of identity. It was also tied into, if you look at Raja Shahada's writings around Samud, it was very much tied into this idea of ways in which for people to articulate that they will remain steadfast on the land. So these type of imagery are not divorced from a political context in which people were taking the stand despite all the hardships and occupation to remain steadfast. So I'm just showing you kind of these different recurring imagery that you see that is, again, continuously timeless. And as well, the specific details of the landscape, like the olive trees, all become unified. They all become very pattern-like, rather than particular, let's say, botanical kind of studies of the specificity of the different types of trees or agriculture that we have. It becomes, again, very generic. This is also by Nabila Nani. And again, you often have this lone female figure is always in the landscape of her own, that you sense that she's remained there in the village, or she needs protection, or we should be taking care of. It's very utopic. There's no signs of any, again, of the modernization of agricultural equipment. There's no tractors. There's no all the mechanisms are just absent from all these works. The humble foods as well became a very popular work by Slimane Mansour. It was reproduced on posters and postcards. This idea of the frugal meal that the peasant, the fallah, would eat, the bread and the olives and the tomato and onion, of being a very simple, very simple dish. And it was the idea that to try and to get everybody to identify themselves with being a fallah was a way in which to keep everybody tied to the landscape. But I mean, this incredible focus on village life also not only there's a question about then what happens to all our cities and the transformation of our cities and all this identification with the villages, but then also the way in which a lot of historical detail is flattened out in order to create these type of villages. This is now coming up, but these traditions were not just in the 80s. This is coming up to the present day, and these are a lot of the new works by Nabila Nani. So if we think of our contemporary landscape in and around Ramallah, it's undergoing incredible construction and transformation. And again, this is absent in these works. You see these particular paintings. Again, they're also deeply patterned, patterned to the point that they almost look like embroidery. But what's very intriguing here is also the absence of the human presence, the absence of anyone working in these landscapes or being in these landscapes. Well, we're going back to these empty landscapes, which we'll see in a couple of slides ahead, recurring in different places. What type of utopia, what type of Palestine are we envisaging if these are the works that have been created by artists at a time when we have a shrinking of the landscape, we have incredible construction taking place in areas where it's political and we have demolitions taking place and so on. We're creating these type of images. What can we understand by that? Why are we creating these types of visions? And what type of vision does this represent? What type of Palestine are we envisioning and thinking of? And it's quite interesting to juxtapose these type of images with some of these images too, which are adverts for Rawabi. So this was a particular one that I found particularly interesting. This idea of looking onto the empty landscape, this uninhabited landscape. What are we saying about Palestine in these type of representations? This starts to tie into the happy family. If we look in this particular work. It's the idea of the view and having a vantage point to look onto the landscape. The ideal couple is represented rather than the larger extended family. We don't tend to get those in a lot of the advertising that we have. Here, just going back to a slide, we have the happy family, but it's a nuclear family. Again, it's not strongly related to our own family structures. So there is again also in the advertising campaigns that we see of Talbot, of Romero, there also is a particular vision of the landscape in relation to a utopia and a future, but it's also tied into property, it's tied into ownership. And it's also tied into, I mean, there's the absences of communities, there's the absence of the historicity of how we've lived in communities in all these works. So again, I'm wondering what kind of vision. And here we've got the two works side by side. So you've got the advert, which has the family looking onto this view, and you have this opportunity that there's going to be opportunity for work and so forth. But if we look at what people are wearing, you know, it's all a particular class of people. It's all a particular type of profession. It's a very specific image that is being projected in these works. So just some kind of questions to think about. I'd like to show you a short video that we can look to try and understand, are we being presented with a utopia or are we being presented with a dystopia in this particular work. It's Larissa Samsour's Nation Estate. So,
We are now arriving at our final destination. Please take all your belongings with you. Next shuttle to Amman Airport in 4 minutes.
Routes.
Jerusalem. Gaza Shore. Located by the Mediterranean floor. The romantic scenes.
بتلحم.
Bethlehem.
state? Are we in a utopia? Are we in a dystopia now? Palestine has been reduced to a tower block. Every floor is a different city. We experience the cities as remakes, as models inside these spaces, and we have a very different representation of the motherland, the mother figure, as we see her looking out onto the scene. So, I mean, Larissa Sansuri uses science fiction to explore questions of the future and the past, and her this work seems to be very foreboding and seems to be speaking to the current situation that we are in as we as high rises and tower blocks are filling our landscape and everything is shrinking. Thank you. If you want any, if you have any. Does anyone have any questions?
I always say that's the first question. First of all, thank you very much. It's beautifully exposes to some really beautiful art that I much wish I'd never seen. When you started, you talked about how you were seeing Palestine from the point of view of outside and then it made me think back to old representations of particularly of Jerusalem and Palestine, going back to the 19th century. And as I saw all your art, that image stayed in my mind, very much so, to the extent that I almost thought that I was seeing the same art updated with modern artistic techniques and styles and that, but much of the image. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent are these representations not so much views of the future, but views of the past, if we can really make that distinction? I have smaller questions, but this is the big one.
Thank you. I wonder if they are images of the past. I think a lot of them are projections. I think they're continually projections of an image of Palestine. And in that, the artists are constantly trying to create an ideal. So then what is that? Then the question is that ideal an empty landscape? Do we want this kind of paradise where we're just on our own there and we're free to roam in this empty landscape? Where are the communities? Where are the people? Where's the habitation? I mean, I find it an intriguing question of why are we creating all these types of representations. I don't know if I have any one answer. I don't think it's a replica of the 19th century type of representation that had a very specific political agenda, and that was about vacating the landscape, saying the Palestinians weren't here, and showing it as a land without a people for a people without a land. I don't think that's what's happening in the artistic discourse. I think it's much more about creating some kind of dreamscape that all our present reality is vacated from it. I think that's probably more an incredible beautification of it. I think that's more probably the impetus.
Sort of the same question or comment.
Yeah. Well, there are like two different kinds of utopias. Like one connected with the Palestinian Authority project, imagining Palestine as a modern country like Berlin or cities like. And I'm mainly thinking about artworks like Al Jarrah's the national stamp, or Muhammad Al-Musal's in Gaza, the metro stations, imagining Gaza place looks like Berlin or London, where you can take a metro and commute. And on the other, then this is more like in contemporary context, but in mostly in conventional context, like in universities, like in Najaf or Quds, students mostly still paint as in the past. Like, you go to a degree show, you see more like most of the students still doing the embroidery, the Dome of the Rock, and so what is the reality? Like, what I mean, how those kind of utopias are kind of like dealing with the reality that we see, the reality of fragmentation, the reality of the failure of the peace process, the reality of lack of any solution or any dream.
Well, maybe it's more of a political question.
I have the same question. Where is it? Where is it in the works? it this nostalgia? Is it an ambivalence? Is it an escape from reality? You know, what kind of utopia is it that we're creating? You know, it's more. It raises more questions, I think.
Yeah.
Jack.
I have like a small question. Like, how do you feel like the 80s art, the 80s Palestinian art, the whole utopian, the whole looking to the past and looking for like a dream-like state, right? How do you feel like it's affecting the youth and the modern art of Palestinians? It's like usually, like lately they're saying that Palestinians aren't having any more, or not original art, but like more modern like and more.
I've spent the last 10 years teaching in the International Academy of Art, and I think we very much saw this as a historical period in Palestinian art. I think a lot of the students were dealing with the issues of their everyday experience in different kinds of way. And although Wissam mentioned that maybe in some universities and some colleges there is still this use of the vocabulary of the Palestinian Torb and these different symbols that have become, I call it a vocabulary because I really feel like it's a set, very particular language. If you want to create a work about Palestinian identity, then you put the jar and you put the key and you put the you put the kufiyah and you put the Palestinian Torb and you have your recipe. It's there. It's formulaic. I think a lot of young artists are trying to explore through different mediums and through different languages what their experience is, and I think it's opening up a whole load of new type of art. So I think they definitely see this as a historical era that passed. But this question is around utopias and dystopias and what kind of vision of Palestine is being echoed, or is being seen in works. And that's why I put the posters in particular, because it's not just Rawabi. If you look at a lot of the posters for major companies, there's always this image of the happy family, there's always particular types of landscapes, so it's intriguing because this is reaching a very large, it's reaching the population through all the billboards and through Facebook and so on. So what is this image that they are creating? I think we also need to be looking at what popular culture is and commercial enterprises are actually putting out there as well. Hi.
I just have a small question. If you had a chance to chat with Sliman regarding, his TVs.
Yes. Himself and Nabil very much speak about about two things. One about this in the 80s of how important it was to articulate cultural identity and how they felt that this was their responsibility and that they very much needed to have this in their works. And the other is that they started going back to the villages and they had this kind of nostalgia for the village and they went to paint outdoors, and so they do have this kind of nostalgia, I would say, to life. So,
Is it because both of them were originally from?
I think so. I think that could have that could have definitely a reading into the works like that. I think so. So they do have this romance around You can tell us about the 80s. Maybe my interpretations
I wanted to share something that I've been thinking about for a long time now. In my work, in my studying of photography and following where it came from and how the image was reproduced, I of course stumbled on the first, so to speak, first photographers, and we can call them local photographers, like Khalil Raad and Garamdian. And when I looked at their work, I mean, the bulk of it, even in the catalog of Khalil Ra'ad, the original catalog that I saw, he actually copied the kind of the exact same imagery that were reproduced by Bonfils before him, by Lumiere, by whoever was producing these images in the 18th century. And the answer was, the logical answer to why was he kind of copying, and also Garabedian with the studio images of people kind of cross-dressing and into Bedouin or Fallahin dresses. The logical explanation was, this was the market. The market actually wanted that. And what does that mean? Meaning those people who have the money to consume and buy have a certain image that they want to, want it fulfilled in whatever they buy as artwork or photography to hang in their houses. And that, of course, is informed by what you mentioned earlier, which is the long history of trying to portray this land as a country that is only 2,000-3,000 years old and has nothing to do with the present, and is only about whatever Jesus and David and what have you, and nothing to do with those people who are living here. And hence you have this imagery, kind of regurgitated in so many different ways. And then, of course, we know that in the Arab Revolt, what is called the Arab Revolt, actually at that time, the local urban leadership and people like Abdul Qadir Husseini had to kind of take off his tabouch and his drip and wear kafiyya and kind of align his image with that of the Fallah, because it was the Fallahin who started there the confrontations or the struggle against the Zionist occupation of the land. And hence, after him, Arafat took the same symbol and wore it, and that's where you get Sliman and Nabil, kind of being so much into these symbols of the Fallah, of the village, of the kafiyya, as you said, of the dress, of the embroidery, of that empty landscape again. Like it or not, this is what was fed as imagery and representations, and this was, as I said, regurgitated and reproduced in so many different ways. So my idea of Nabil and Sliman is primarily, again, like Ra'ad and Garabedian. They were catering for the market. First and foremost, nostalgia or no nostalgia, this comes second or third, The money comes first.
I think you sealed it there. Yes. Yeah. I think that's very that people want a particular type of image. Absolutely.
And this is what we've been speaking about all the time.
Yeah.
If you don't change the image,
what about, for example, all the richness of Jerusalem by just creating this
totally.
stereotype?
And how can you change the image if you're not empowered by the tools of being able to produce the image?
Yes.
So this is where the education system comes in, and that's where we're totally at a loss. Because since we're not taught from kind of young age, everybody's taught of how to produce an image, how to make an image, then you'll never be able to control this image, and it will always be superimposed. So what these guys at the Rawabi and Bank of Palestine do is actually copy-paste from Dubai, which is, a totally weird reinterpretation, Arabized interpretation of what the West, of how the West sees the Middle East and the Orient, and all produced by these big firms, these big advertising companies who are basically entrenched into Orientalism. So follow the money. That's the answer.
Yeah, I mean it's very true what you're saying with this particular man, and this diaspora image too as well. You're saying it's communism divided. It's a very,
Totally.
very
The
image.
other day I don't know where I was, in Ramallah or somewhere, and they had this image of this new building that is coming up, and in this model, this whatever you produce in architecture, these models, visuals, they had everybody with that shadid. Like, where is this? Is it Ramallah or in?
So there's a nice quote by W.J.T. Mitchell. He says, and this is something he wrote in 1999. He says, "Is it not the case that Palestine's problem is that it has been reduced to a landscape, framed, hedged about, shaped, controlled, and surveyed from every possible perspective? I notice that a piece of landscape is now being discussed to be the key to peace between Israel and Palestinians. The famous 3% of arid land, now occupied by a few Bedouin and many lizards. It is to be given to the Palestinians with one catch. It is not to be developed, it is to be left, in short, as a natural preserve, in short, a landscape to be seen and not touched and not dwelled upon." You know, so there is this obsession that we want this kind of, yeah, and you're tying it back to, or that's what you're tying it to, yeah, and the consuming of it. You know? But why do we want to vacate it? Why do we also want to vacate it?
The worst sin, I think, the Palestinians have committed is that they're speculating on their land.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like really insane. I mean, if you think about it logically, you speculate on your own land, and you're just cycling the money.
There's the video advert for Tabu. It's very similar to Rawari, but it has a single house. It has a single villa all by itself in an empty landscape. I opened it up on YouTube. So it's completely on its own. I mean, it's confounding, but you know. But it's like it's again like everybody wants their own Palestine. There are so many different versions of Palestine. You know. Said if we were to cover a map with all the different Palestines, there's no left for the place. No left for the place. There's so many. Everybody wants their own little. Everybody wants their own
But coming back to your comment about the art market, because it usually is, I think, an urban elite that kind of determines the demand, and it has the money to buy these works of arts and to establish galleries, then why is there such a neglect of the city life and of also pre-Nakba cultural city life, which is not really depicted?
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
I think what Jack was saying about the identification with the Fallah, it was almost...
this is totally embedded in our imaginary Palestine. So we want to buy this imaginary Palestine, no matter who we are, be it a real Fallah or somebody, you know, kind of a rich, you know, urban lawyer.
Urban lawyer has that utopia of Palestine. Why do they also?
Because it was over the years, you know, as I said, reproduced.
As a national identity, that was what your national identity.
It started with the Orientalist vision of what is Palestine, and people learned how to do that and are copying. And since this is what sells, they keep copying it.
But maybe also because the development of the city was cut in a way because of the occupation. So people don't see the city as their cities as a reflection of their identity.
Or as a place to identify with. But again, you know,
But
they were also cut from the villages too, with all the hundreds and thousands of refugees. But we were so entrenched in the kofia and the zit and the za'atar, and you know, this whole point through this that we identify. You still go into people's homes and they'll have, you know, Palestinian cushions, and they'll have all these items there. So we're really they're like these are our signs.
These are the only identifiers.
Not the signs of the city life that was in Jerusalem.
Or Haifa, or
yeah.
Jaffa, or, you know.
Very
And that's where all the intellectuals were. That's where actually, supposedly, this image being produced, but they were actually copying from the Orientalists.
Self-orientalizing.
Absolutely, copying.
And Samud and this idea of the Falah was very prominent, I understand, in the 80s. This was what people were you know, really holding onto. And it's in so many works. I mean, I maybe images that I have were Slimans in the fields, but it was all across. Kamal Mughni and Talib Dwight, and there's a whole repertoire of this. And as Bassam said, it's even still being reproduced in universities. Look at all our neckband posters, you know, the recurrence of the type of images there as well. So, yeah, there's a lot that's omitted. I'm always very curious about what's left out and what historically was happening at the time when they create these images.
But it's really, I'm just trying to steer the conversation, but really interesting. It's really funny because those buyers of like artworks, they do appreciate this kind of practices in the works of Slimane Mansour, and so it's accepted that Slimane Mansour and Nabil can still do this until this moment,
Yes.
and nobody's interested in young artists doing these things.
Yeah, that's true, and it's this, and as you said, it's the market, and it's still what is being sold and the type of images that people want to, the type of work that they want to have. They don't want to have the reality of what's going on in Palestine on their wall or in their collection. They want this stream. It is also, as you said, becoming very privatized and becoming very orientated into kind of real estate, and
it's
it's
again
my
more,
private,
more
it's my-
speculation.
it's my private Palestine.
Yes.
Some of those paintings really reminded me of the workers working together and so forth, of these like Russian and propaganda, Chinese propaganda paintings. The ideal society is communist, socialist, ideal society. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, you know, it's largely forgotten today, but Palestine in the 70s, 80s, before they found a really big part of the third world in the communist sense, not in the economic sense, the Viet Cong and all this. How that relates to the global imaginary of socialist utopia.
What do you think in that question? I think, for example, when you ask Slimane Mansour, was he particularly influenced by particular artists, for example? He's more, he said he was more influenced by Stanley Spencer and particular artists creating works of particular of English landscapes. I was quite surprised. Their references, these artists are very wide, so they would be looking at Russian works, they would be looking at works from across the globe. I think my understanding of the 80s was that it was a very harsh period in terms of a clampdown on the articulation of identity. It was very severe. At the same time, there was opportunities that were being opened up for work in Israel. It was also, the economy was booming at the time. So it's quite contradictory what was going on before, the First Intifada, took place. So it's not any one kind of way in which we can define it in relation to all these works. I think there were quite a different number of things going on. But as I understand it, Salim Tamari writes about this, of how much of village life was transformed because of the people working inside Israel. He's written about this. So I hope that answers part of your question.
I just want to follow up a little bit with what these two gentlemen were talking about, basically about art that sells them. If you look at the graduate that's out, or probably at your students too, you don't find so much this type of art. You find a very different type of art that speaks more about today in many ways. You also see a lot of escape to abstract art, but if you're looking at non-abstract art, it's not looking at the past, it's looking at the present in different ways. That's not represented here in some way. How do you see that in terms of your utopias?
Well, I think there's a period in Palestinian art that I feel a lot of artists were either working on this kind of nostalgia of the past, or they were working on images of the future and the archive. But there was this absence of the nitty-grittiness of the present was not in a lot of work, and I think that happens quite a bit. That we're either focusing on a future, or we're looking back in the past, but the actual tackling the reality of the present, it, you know, kind of slips in and out of the visual field. There was a period of time when this was also prominent, the archived future, the nostalgic past, but what was actually happening under our feet was not always. But I think these are all ways in which people are dealing with the reality, and also, as Jack mentioned, dealing with the market as well. I mean, aside from the commercial market of, and same is also the marketplace of where curators are selecting works to be part of biennales or be part of international participation. So there also is a perception of what they're expecting of Palestinian artists too.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you very much. Thank